Hello, and welcome to our July webinar on The Heat is On Heat Injury and Illness Prevention in Outdoor and Indoor Work Settings. I think if we all look at the temperature of regardless of where we are, this is probably a pretty pertinent topic for here middle in July. But again, welcome to the webinar. My name is Jackie Baxley, and we're happy here at HRP to present this webinar for us today. If you're not familiar with HRP, for over 40 years, we have worked with our clients to ensure that they move their environment forward. And what we mean by that is we work to minimize environmental and compliance risk with our clients' projects and help them reach their business goals. We are a multidisciplinary environmental compliance and engineering consulting firm with several offices across the country. As we look at this presentation today on heat and the emerging standards relative to heat, as we bring you this topic, just wanted to kind of point out, not only are we bringing you this topic as professionals within the occupational safety and health arena, but also we have employees that work in the field. We might have employees kind of across the country today that might be drilling wells, might be taking stormwater samples or groundwater samples. So we have employees that are also exposed to heat. So we'll be kind of presenting to this not only as that health and safety professional, but also one that is also living and breathing this regulatory requirement. Again, my name is Jackie Baxley. I am the practice leader of HRP's Environmental Health, Safety, and Sustainability practice. And as I present this information to you today, I'm coming to you with I just now say over 25 years of EHS&S experience. I've worked both in industry and in consulting. So as we look at our agenda for our webinar today, I want to not only go through the agenda, but also just some functionality of the webinar platform that we're using. First of all, my colleague Andrew is going to be uploading some handouts in the chat. Always a common question, will handouts be available? So yes, indeed. You will have a copy of all of these slides that we're going through, as well as hopefully a helpful supplemental handout, which is acronyms, definitions, and some helpful links. If for some reason you're not able to access those documents that Andrew just uploaded, don't worry, we will send a follow-up email after the webinar with those attached as well. And please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function within the webinar platform for any questions that you have. Even if it runs us into a little bit of overtime, we'll address all the questions that are popped in. And any questions that might come through right as we close, that always seems to happen, that one last question gets in right as we close the webinar, and a follow-up email, we will provide any supplemental answers to any questions that came in after the mark. So with that being said, the agenda for our webinar today on this emerging OSHA heat standard is first just to give a little bit of background information on why is this a hot topic. And I promise that will be the only pun that I will use throughout the presentation relative to heat. But we'll kind of set the scene of why are we even looking at this as a topic. And then there is a proposed rule out there that OSHA has, and that rule is not dead. It is still going through the rulemaking process. And so we're going to spend some time introducing you to the contents of that proposed rule. And then we're going to wrap up with some best practices that you can employ to keep your employees safe relative to this recognized hazard of heat. Right, so jumping right in. So why is this a hot topic? Well, as we look at heat, it's important to recognize that heat is actually the leading cause of death among all hazardous weather conditions in the United States. As we look at the statistics over the years, on average, there are 40 work-related heat fatalities per year. And on average, just shy of 3,500 cases of days away from work because of heat. So we actually did a very similar webinar to this about 3 years ago. And that was because in 2022 or 2023, that general area, OSHA had an emphasis program on heat. And so when we last did that webinar, I think it was 2022, these stats that you see here from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics have actually gone up since we did that initial webinar. Noting that we've had our highest heat of record since then, it's reasonable to anticipate that this is going to continue to be an issue with our changing climate and with the more and more days of high heat. And the figure that you see here, this figure shows the annual rates for death as classified as heat-related by medical professionals in the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. The orange line that you see, that shows the deaths for which heat was listed as the main or underlying cause. The blue line shows deaths for which heat was listed as either an underlying or contributing cause of death. So just realize that there are direct and underlying or contributing issues relative to health that heat can pose. So some of these health-related issues that we're concerned about with heat, they're both, you can kind of classify these into direct effects and indirect effects. So on the direct effects, we're probably all familiar with medical scenarios such as heat stroke and heat exhaustion or fainting because of the heat or heat cramps. Some of the ones that most might not be as known is the exposure to heat can rapidly break down your muscles. It can cause sodium in your blood to fall below normal levels. That's why sometimes providing electrolytes is helpful. Edema, which is swelling of the soft tissues, and it can even impact your kidney health. Now, I'm not on camera here just to protect everybody's bandwidth for the webinar, but I am very fair-skinned. I'm a redhead, freckled, fair-skinned person, and I had the luxury of being on vacation last week, and without fail, regardless of how much sunscreen I wear, I get heat rash. Whether I get burned or not. So folks can have, severe effects or kind of just nuisance effects, like, me getting a heat rash whenever I spend more than, 3 days in the sun. Now, the indirect effects, those of us in the occupational health and safety world, we know that distractions can cause safety issues. So we have the direct effects of heat, but just people being hot, people being uncomfortable can lead to indirect health effects or safety impacts as well. You'll get sweaty palms, right? Which might mean you drop things, which could cause a quality issue or a potential safety issue. I used to work in chemical and textile manufacturing, and fogging up of the safety glasses was always a concern when you've got heat and maybe high humidity. That could cause distractions. That could cause people not to want to wear their safety glasses. That could have a health impact. Dizziness, reduced brain function, distraction. We've all been hot. We know we're probably not at our best when we're hot. Maybe we're a little moody. Maybe we're a little, just distracted. And it's also going to reduce our reaction time and our speed time. And all of these indirect effects might not lead to a direct effect from the heat, but could contribute to other health and safety and even quality type concerns. Now, there are different risk factors. So folks are not going to respond the same to heat. Risk factors from the personal perspective include things like age, weight, underlying health conditions, as well as drug use. And I don't mean just illicit drug use. Many of us might be on prescription medications for some reason, and a lot of those prescription medications will have warnings along the lines of limit your exposure to heat or limit your exposure to sun, because the way that the drug interacts could, maybe weaken your body's response to deal with heat or direct sun. And then alcohol and caffeine use also contribute to personal risk factors, in addition to those like me with the Irish curse of fair hair, fair skin and red hair. In addition to the personal risk factors, there are occupational risk factors. So maybe you're have employees that are exerting themselves based off of their job task. Maybe it's a high physical activity. So that workload is going to contribute to the risk factors associated with heat. Environmental conditions, such as the just the workspace of where they are. Maybe it's tighter. Maybe there's not as much airflow. Maybe there's some radiant heat or equipment in the area. Lack of acclimation, your body can acclimate to the heat. So folks are typically at most risk when they are new to a potential work scenario that is exposing them to heat. And then some of us have to wear very specific clothing for our jobs. And depending on what that clothing is or that PPE is, it could also restrict your body's ability to cool itself. So those are some occupational risk hazards in addition to the personal risk hazards. And then finally, the environmental risk hazards. And this is just the environment in which we are working in, the heat index, radiant heat, the ability for the air to move within the area. And we'll be talking quite a lot about heat index as we continue through our webinar. Now, we're talking about this program today, obviously because heat is an issue, right? But also this still is continuing through the regulatory process. So for several years now, there's been various action for OSHA launching a campaign back in 2011, followed a couple of years thereafter with NIOSH updating its criteria for recommendation for a standard relative to heat. Followed thereafter with OSHA releasing enhanced, expanded measures to protect workers from heat. And then it really started to heat up, sorry for the pun, in October of 2021. And that was when OSHA published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for heat injury and illness prevention, not only in outdoor spaces, but also in indoor settings. And that kicked off the rulemaking process. And then shortly thereafter, a little bit more than not even quite a year later, about 6 months later, OSHA launches the National Emphasis Program to protect workers from indoor or outdoor heat hazards. This is when we brought the last heat webinar, was when this National Emphasis Program was issued. That National Emphasis Program was set to expire, but it was actually extended. So technically, we are still in this National Emphasis Program to protect workers from heat. And then in August of 2024, OSHA actually published the notice of proposed rulemaking. And this was kind of the first draft, if you will, of the rule for heat injury and illness prevention in outdoor and indoor settings. And then January, before the change in administration, OSHA did expand the National Emphasis Program. Technically, it is still in effect, but I can't speak to how active our current OSHA administration is in acting on that National Emphasis Program, but it is still technically on the books. But OSHA is still continuing through the rulemaking process for this proposed standard that was published in 2024. Actually, just recently, just a few weeks ago, OSHA held a series of public hearings over a 2-week period on this proposed rule to get input as the rule continues through the process. Now, there are also states with specific heat standards, and we're not going to go through the nuances of those, but just if you happen to have operations in these states, realize that there are states that have rules, whether it's associated with indoor, some are indoor and outdoor, some have different rules depending on whether it's indoor and outdoor. So in addition to these OSHA standards, be aware that you could have operations in a state that have their own standard. And then as we're talking about heat exposure, recognizing it's both indoor and outdoor exposure concerns. So the OSHA draft rule is indoor and outdoor. Some of those states are only focused on one or the other. But kind of think about it, right? Like, so types of exposure to heat in outdoor settings. We have employers that are in the landscaping space or agriculture or construction. oil and gas well operations. Those are all activities that are outdoors, including mail and package delivery. As I was mentioning earlier, HRP, we are not only a provider of consultation services for health and safety, but we also, through our environmental services team, we have a lot of employees that are working outdoors at any given time. So you can be an employer that has employees exposed both to indoor heat and outdoor heat, depending on what their operations are. And on the indoor heat, whether it's fire response or emergency response, foundries are obviously going to be high indoor heat settings. Sometimes specific spaces within a facility, such as an electrical room or a boiler room, is going to be higher heat. And then specific industries or factories. For example, as I mentioned earlier, I worked in textiles for about 5 years or so, and then I worked in the chemical industry for about 4 years. And so, speaking about a hot indoor environment in textiles, we would dye and finish the textiles. And so, finishing, essentially, we had these things called tinners, which were essentially big ovens that the fabric just rolled right through. And in the winter, when you were a little chilly, just walking between those tinners would warm you right up. But in the summer, it was miserable. So different types of industry are going to have either those operations or those areas that are going to have heat exposure. And then warehousing, typically, depending on the warehousing space, they're not always air conditioned. And then bakery workers, or really any type of worker that's working around things of whether it's an industrial oven or a process oven or what have you. All right, so with that framework, if you will, of why are we even concerned about heat, I think probably just about everybody could probably step outside today and understand why we're worried about heat. But now at least that scene has been set, let's talk about the contents of the proposed rule. And I want to highlight, I'm not going to dig in deep on the contents of the proposed rule because it's a proposed rule. This is not the final rule. As I just mentioned, there was just 2 weeks of public comments. So I totally anticipate the next draft rule to be different than what it currently is. But I at least want you to be familiar with this at a high level because there is still a recognized risk of heat potentially for your employees. And so if nothing else, under the general duty clause of OSHA, you do need to protect your workers from known hazards. And we know that heat is a hazard. So in knowing the general contents of the proposed rule, that can maybe help you a little bit in recognizing the risk and controlling the risk that you might have at your work setting. All right, so the proposed rule, and I should highlight here, one of those handouts that my colleague Andrew uploaded to the chat is a handout that has acronyms, a few definitions, and some helpful links. So one of the links that is in that handout is a link to this proposed rule. So you can read the whole Federal Register relative to this proposed rule. So if you want to dig in deeper on any of these, that link is provided for you. But as we look at high level at the contents of the proposed rules, first under the scope and application of the rule, it's interesting to note that this rule applies to anybody under OSHA jurisdiction. So that includes general industry, construction, maritime, and agriculture. So they're not distinguishing between certain, categories, if you will. But there are some exclusions currently. Again, just don't get too emotionally attached to any of these because it's draft, it's proposed. But there are some specific exclusions at current, such as if there's no reasonable expectation of exposure at or above what's called the initial heat trigger. We're going to define that here in a moment. And what they mean here is if you're an outdoor worker and it's only outdoor seasonal work in the winter, and you're in an area where the winter temperatures are cooler than those initial heat triggers, like maybe snow plowing or something like that, then obviously the standards are going to apply. And then short duration exposure is currently carved out. And what they define as short duration exposure is if an employee is exposed to the initial heat trigger, again, we're going to define that in a moment, for less than 15 minutes during any 60-minute period. Organizations whose primary function is firefighting or emergency response is currently excluded from this proposed rule. Indoor work areas or vehicles where air conditioning consistently keeps the ambient temperature below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Telework is excluded, and then sedentary work indoors is excluded. So recognize at your place of employment, you can be in the rule and out of the rule depending on what different people are doing. So, for example, you could have a forklift driver. And that forklift driver might be considered sedentary work indoors. But maybe that forklift driver is indoors and outdoors, or maybe they're in the forklift for a little bit, but then they hop off of the forklift and then they're doing something very active. So that goes from sedentary to non-sedentary. So realize that there's going to be scenarios where you're going to be jumping in and out of this. And as we talk a little bit more about the rule, we'll talk about how you address that. Another just example is you could have workers that are teleworkers for maybe 2 days of the week, but 3 days of the week they're out in the field. So these you're really going to have some kind of job specific programs associated with this rule. Now, the definitions. I mentioned the initial heat trigger. There are two points that prompt action in the standard. The initial heat trigger and the high heat trigger. The initial heat trigger is when the heat index gets to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, where the high heat trigger is when the heat index gets to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not going to focus a lot on what's called the wet bulb globe temperature readings, because even in OSHA's draft rule, they recognize that very few, if any, organizations are going to invest in a wet bulb globe thermometer. And so they recognize that most people are going to drive their program based off of the heat index. So I'm going to focus on the heat index piece throughout this webinar. So heat index of 80 is the initial or above is the initial heat trigger, where high heat trigger is going to be 90 degrees heat index. And then that heat index, just as info, that is a measurement that takes into consideration not only temperature, but also humidity. All right, so the next piece in the proposed rule is the Heat Injury and Illness Prevention Plan, also referred to as the HIP. So under the proposed rule, you are going to have a written plan, and the contents of that plan will list the types of work activities covered by the plan. Because remember, we're just talking about what's in and what's out. You're going to have maybe different work activities, different departments, different tasks that might be in or out at any point in time. Policies and procedures to comply with the standard will be baked into your written plan. You're going to identify the heat metric that you're going to use to monitor when you need to activate the plan. Again, that's going to be either the heat index or the wet bulb globe temperature. But again, I'm going to focus on heat index. You're going to evaluate heat stress hazards when you have employees in vapor impermeable clothing. Think of like PPE that doesn't breathe, for example. And then you're going to designate a heat safety coordinator, and that heat safety coordinator is going to implement and monitor the plan. Now, additional considerations for this HIP is the relative to the process of developing it and making it available. It currently states in the rule that you must seek input and involvement from non-managerial workers or their representatives in the plan preparation. So this can't be a plan that is just created straight in the health and safety office or straight in the HR office. You've got to get involvement of the people actually working out in the heat for the development of this plan. It's interesting. We don't normally see that in OSHA standards, but you do see that a lot in ISO 45001 for those of you that have a health and safety management system. That really aligns with what we see in that health and safety management system. And you need to make the plan available to employees in a language that the employee understands. So whether it's, and also take that in consideration for the training, because it also applies to the training as well. So if you have a multilingual workforce population, and if you have employees that are not able to read English, then you're going to need to make sure that you're making that plan available to them, as well as the training available to them in a language that they understand. And then we're going to have to review, evaluate, and keep that plan up to date. Now, part of that plan, right, is to identify those areas or those tasks that are going to be subject to high heat. It's going to require a monitoring program to monitor heat to identify when and where employees are exposed to heat at or above the initial and high heat triggers. So outdoors, you could track local heat index forecast. Or measure a metric of your choosing. Indoors, you're typically going to be identifying work areas with reasonable expectation that employees are or may be exposed to heat at or above that initial heat trigger, and then monitor to identify when that trigger occurs. Or you can just assume employees are going to be exposed to heat instead of monitoring. You can say, for example, from this month to this month, we're just going to activate the plan and just bypass that. So you can just assume as opposed to monitor. Stay tuned for the best management practices portion or for just some ideas on tracking and monitoring that heat. And then once you identify that you have the temperature, the heat index has gotten to that initial heat trigger, this is where the actions hop in. So once you hit that initial heat trigger, remember that's 80 degrees Fahrenheit heat index, you must provide water. You must provide cool, potable drinking water and access to toilet facilities. Because you will have people that will not drink water if they don't have reasonable access to toilet facilities. So you got to provide water and sanitation. And you have to be able to provide 1 quart of water per employee per hour. So making sure that you have adequate water to meet those minimum expectations. You also have to provide breaks. If you're at an outdoor setting, that break must be readily accessible and provided either shade or AC in that break area. And it must be adequately sized based off the number of employees expected to be on break. So if you're expecting 50 employees to be on break at the same time, then one pop-up tent is not going to hold 50 people, right? So you got to make sure that the shaded area or the air-conditioned area is going to be appropriate size to accommodate all of those on breaks. Now, in indoor spaces, air-conditioned or increased airflow areas for those break spaces. Also, with the initial heat trigger, I found this pretty helpful from the Federal Register, and I wanted to pop it in here for you guys as a reference. And it also identifies, the proposed rules identifies, once we hit this initial heat trigger, to evaluate when fan use is harmful. We talk about increased air movement can be a positive thing in mitigating the impacts of heat, but sometimes the temperature is so hot and the humidity range is to a point that the air movement is actually harmful. So I found this to be a very helpful chart that says, based off of the ambient temperature and based off of the humidity range, when is a fan helpful and when is a fan hurtful. On that initial heat trigger, so not only are we going to provide breaks and water, but we're also going to make sure that we have an acclimatization protocol for new or returning workers, such as implementing, the more robust high heat triggers for those that are new to the role, or stepping up the work shift in percentage increments. So, for example, if you have a new worker, start them at 20% of their workload and then go up 20% each day until they're at 100. And that will help them acclimate to that heat setting. If you have a returning worker, and what OSHA defines as a returning worker, it means that they've been away from the workspace for 14 days. So maybe there's a medical leave or a sabbatical or something along those lines. Returning workers, you start at the 50% mark, and then you go up to 60% and then to 80%. And so by day 4, they'll be at 100%. So in addition to the acclimatization process, you're going to, at the initial heat trigger, you're going to allow and encourage rest breaks. They're not required. They're going to be required. Rest breaks are going to be required when you hit that high heat. But here we're allowing and encouraging those breaks, and those breaks must be paid. So they can't clock out for the break. And then we need to make sure we have effective two-way communication to check in on our employees. We're checking for signs and symptoms. We're talking to our employees, making sure everybody's okay. Some of the heat triggers you might see, the indicators of heat illness, sometimes are slurred speech, sometimes confusion, sometimes irritability. So sometimes you can catch that in just checking in with your employees that are in these high heat settings. And then providing cooling PPE. And if you're providing that PPE, it's not required here, but if you're providing that cooling PPE, you need to make sure that you're maintaining the cooling properties of that PPE. For example, some of the cooling PPE has to remain wet. So you have to be able to provide access for that to remain wet. So that's the initial heat trigger of 80 degrees Fahrenheit heat index. The high heat trigger is at 90 degrees Fahrenheit relative to the heat index. So that's not ambient temperature, it's 90 degrees. This is heat index, which is taking into account humidity and temperature. So once we hit that 90 heat index, we are now required paid rest breaks of 15 minutes for every 2 hours. I say required, this is a proposed rule, so I should say potentially required because it's just a proposed rule at this point. Observe workers for signs and symptoms via either the buddy system or a supervisor or safety coordinator checking in on everybody. Here, if the supervisor or safety coordinator way is being used, there can't be more than a 20-to-1 ratio. So one safety coordinator to 20 employees, one supervisor to 20 employees. And then you're going to issue a hazard alert to employees prior to that work shift. So that could be like a safe brief, to start the morning or what have you. You're going to post warning signs at indoor spaces where you have knowledge of the ambient temperature regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Finally, the final elements of this proposed rule includes you're going to have emergency response planning actions within your plan. You could have that baked into that HIP, or you can maybe reference if you have a standalone emergency action plan that takes into account heat-related illnesses. You could reference that. But if it's not in your emergency action plan, make sure that your emergency response procedures for folks experiencing signs and symptoms or heat are in your HIP. You're going to be required to have training. That training is going, as currently written, the training is required before exposure to initial heat triggers, and training including not only the signs and symptoms of heat exposure, but the protocols that y'all have deployed for your facility, as well as their rights to be involved in planning and preparation of those controls. You're going to loop in details of the emergency response procedures. And again, this training has to be done in a language that they understand. So, for example, depending on where you are, right? We've got people from all over the country here, right? And like the higher heat time periods could come in April for some of you, if you're maybe in Florida or Arizona, or maybe the high heat period doesn't happen until May or June. But before you get to that heat time period, that's when you're going to do the training, and it's going to be recurring and supplemental as needed. All right. So again, I went through that pretty quickly because it's a proposed rule. So that's currently how it is written today. I totally anticipate changes because of that 2-week public comment hearing period we just went through. And actually, if you read if you're having problems sleeping tonight, if you want to read that Federal Register, you'll see actually within the proposed rule that OSHA even indicated this is where we're looking for feedback. And so it's those questions that they posed in that proposed rule of where they're looking for feedback is where I would anticipate some of those changes occurring because of the feedback they received during that 2-week public hearing period. All right. So since it's just a proposed rule, really the only thing governing heat safety, if you will, at this point in time is if you're in a state with a heat standard, then that's going to be the governing rule. If you're not in a state with the heat standard, then it's going to be OSHA's general duty clause. So we recognize now that heat is an issue. We can look at the proposed rule and develop programs that comply currently with that proposed rule. And then also thread in these best practices of what you can do today as we're waiting for this proposed rule to continue to make its way through the rule making process. So, kind of first and foremost, what we can do today is just recognize that heat is a hazard that we can proactively address. And also, I think the most important thing for us to recognize, I think we all recognize that heat is a hazard, but recognize the fear employees may have in speaking up or speaking out, or the desire that employees may have to just push through. Part of a good heat control program or heat exposure control program is, again, that involvement of those employees that are exposed to heat to take away maybe some of that stigma of taking a break, to take away some of that stigma where they think they have to push through. So a lot of, if you look at the OSHA case histories of some of those fatalities, you'll see a common theme as people were just pushing through. Or you'll also see a common theme that people were new to the job and they were wanting to excel. So they didn't pause, they didn't rest, they didn't take breaks. And that really contributed to those heat impacts. And then the next thing in this recognition step is to identify where you have employees exposed to heat and look both indoors and outdoors. So once we recognize, the next step of any type of hazard recognition program is to evaluate how much of a hazard is that. Many of you in the health and safety world, right, are very familiar with the process of conducting a hazard assessment. And I would imagine that many of you already have protocols in place at your workplace to identify, to go through the hazard assessment. And what we commonly see with hazard assessments is that there's some degree of exposure, frequency, likelihood, your ability to control the effectiveness of those controls that all get kind of considered. And then there's some type of score or ranking. And those that score or rank above a certain amount, you've identified pose too significant of a risk, and therefore you implement additional controls. This is no different from your normal hazard assessment protocols. It's just you might need to tweak your normal hazard assessment protocols based off of the unique nature of heat hazards. So when you're conducting a hazard assessment relative to heat, which you are going to need to do, at least according to the way the proposed rule is written, because the proposed rule, remember, it states that you need to list the types of work activities covered by that plan and identify where and when employees are exposed to heat at or above that initial heat trigger or that high heat trigger. So all of that can be accomplished with a hazard assessment, but you can do that hazard assessment now before the rule to identify where you need to either augment or implement controls. So again, if you're doing your hazard assessment, whether you're updating your current protocols for hazard assessment or you're starting from scratch, what you want to take into consideration to identify the hazard level is the heat index or that wet bulb globe temperature. Again, as I mentioned earlier, OSHA, even in the Federal Register of this proposed rule, recognizes that very few employers are going to go through the expense of purchasing a thermometer that reads that wet bulb globe temperature. They recognize that most people are going to use the heat index. So you're going to first want a way to identify the heat index of certain areas around the task that you're assessing. Then you're going to want to estimate the workload. Is it sedentary work? Which, if it's sedentary work, the risk is going to be low. Or is it highly active work? And if it's highly active work, then that's going to increase the risk. And then you're going to adjust for clothing Again, based off of the job or the task, the employee might be required to wear that clothing that just does not breathe as well. If they're wearing breathable clothing, that's going to mitigate the risk. If they're not wearing breathable clothing, that's going to elevate the risk. And then you're going to determine whether the worker is acclimatized to the heat. So remember, within typically, assume that a worker is not acclimatized to the work or to that job if they've been doing it less than 2 weeks. So step them into it. And with those points under consideration, then you'll be able to identify a hazard level. Now, some tools for you to use. So some tools, first and foremost, and actually here at HRP, we all have, like at HRP, every employee has a little laminated heat index card like you see here from the National Weather Service. Because again, we have employees that could be sitting in the office today and could be out in the field tomorrow. So we all have these heat index cards. And these heat index cards or these tables are a great tool to help you with identifying the heat index. So what you see here across the top is the temperature. Down the left-hand side is the relative humidity. And what's important to note, just visually, everything that is yellow here is in that initial heat trigger. Everything that's yellow here is at least 80 degrees relative to a heat index. At this threshold of yellow to orange, and if you're not able to see colors, hopefully you can at least see the shading. The first color block is yellow. The second color block is orange. At that threshold between yellow and orange, that's that high heat trigger point of 90 or above. So you can, if you're working in an outdoor space, then you can use probably local weather apps to identify the heat index. National Weather Service does have a heat index app that you can download that will tell you the heat index of where you are and will also relate it to caution, extreme caution, danger, or extreme danger. But if you're in an indoor space, right, the National Weather Service monitoring is not going to help you because you're indoors. And so you're going to have other environmental contributors to what the heat index is. It's pretty simple to order a thermometer and a relative humidity monitor. They are not expensive. Wet bulb globe temperature thermometers are expensive. A relative humidity monitor and the thermometer, you can buy them in combo in one, are not expensive. So you can have somebody that is designated periodically to gauge that on the floor, and then use this cross-reference table, whether it's this table from National Weather Service or there's online heat index calculators where you just put in the relative humidity and you put in the temperature and it tells you what the heat index is. So those are some tools to help you with that first step of the hazard evaluation relative to what is the heat index. Another really helpful tool, again, you might have your own hazard assessment process. And so I'm not telling you not to use your own hazard assessment process. But if you don't have a hazard assessment process, or if your current hazard assessment process doesn't translate well to heat hazards, OSHA has a heat stress calculator. And so you can gather the information for your hazard assessment. Remember, we talked about the heat index, the workload, if the person is acclimatized, why can I not say that word, is acclimated or not, and then that clothing factor. And you can even add body weight, whether you don't have to ask them what their weight is, but whether they're normal weight or overweight. And that will give you the heat stress result, if you will. So you can just gather that information, pop it right into OSHA's heat stress calculator, and it will tell you if it's a heat stress above limits or not. And if it's above limits, then that means you just need to exercise controls. And those controls are what you would then put into that written program. So again, you can use your own hazard assessment that you already have in place. You can tweak it to these details of heat, or you can use OSHA's heat stress calculator. A link to this heat stress calculator is in that handout that you all have. And if you've identified an area where that heat stress is too high, then we implement controls. And just as a reminder, whenever we have to implement controls because we have a high risk, there is a hierarchy of controls. And what we mean by a hierarchy of controls is we want to focus on the most effective controls as opposed to the least effective controls. So eliminating the hazard is always preferred. If you can't eliminate the hazard, can you substitute the hazard or the task to make it less hazardous? Can you deploy engineering controls where you're isolating the people from the hazard? Can you deploy administrative controls, which is going to more change the way we do things? And then last is PPE. PPE is always the least effective control because PPE does nothing to remove the hazard. It only provides a barrier between you and the hazard, but only if the person is properly wearing the PPE. So just a couple of examples of how you could deploy elimination or substitution examples relative to heat. So rest work schedules is one way, and that could be where you just modify what the shift looks like, having those rest breaks, maybe changing your work schedule. For example, many years ago, I did an audit of an industrial facility out in Arizona. And whenever we do an audit, we always ask, hey, what time's your day begin? Because we don't want to, get there at 8 o'clock if they don't start their workday until 9, right? Well, we were doing this audit, I believe it was May in Arizona, and they started their work shift at 4 a.m. And they started their work shift at 4 a.m. because it just got too blasted hot as the day went on, that they had to start their work schedule so early to mitigate the impacts of heat. So that's an example of modifying work schedules. And then just again, the newer returning worker protections, the making sure folks are acclimated to the heat. That's a form of substitution or elimination or working up to that full workload. Reducing metabolic heat load, and that is, can we use certain tools or things to make our workload easier so we're not exerting ourselves as much. And then again, modifying work schedules as well. Maybe not only that example from Arizona I was talking about, but rest periods in between. Examples of some engineering controls we've seen effectively deployed: increasing ventilation, bringing in cooler air to the area, reducing hot temperatures from radiant heat sources. For example, I was talking about when I was in the textile industry, right? And those ovens, if you will, that we ran the fabric through to dry it after the dyeing process. Could there be some shielding, some barriers, some insulation around those hot temperature radiant heat sources within your manufacturing space that will not impact quality of what you're doing and provide some type of engineering barrier to where that radiant heat does not get out into the environment and therefore impact your employees. Air conditioning is not always practical, but when it is practical, air conditioning and providing shade. Just again, a little funny story of back when I was in textiles. We had one of my colleagues read an article along the lines that if you can see the air moving, then people feel cooler than they actually are. And so we had this initiative across all of our manufacturing spaces to add little streamers to all of our fans so that people could see the fan was working and see that air was moving. I don't know if it helped or not because hot is just hot. But we did that to try to show at least that we did have that circulation and ventilation. And then administrative controls. This is where you're going to have that heat alert program. Maybe start the day with a safety minute. Remind people what the protocols are. Remind people of what to be aware of. Have that medical monitoring plan in place. Have those emergency response procedures in place. Ensure employees stay hydrated, even when they're not thirsty. Making people take water breaks. And not only making people take water breaks, but making sure that we're providing water. And in some cases, maybe providing electrolytes. Again, when I was in textile, during the high heat time periods, we actually brought in free Gatorade machines so that folks not only had water, but also had electrolytes if needed. And then written program that's going to document all of this, training in that program. Just remember the program and the training needs to be in a language that they understand. And then have that active communication and buddy system where we are checking on our coworkers periodically through those high heat periods when we've activated that initial heat trigger of a 80 heat index or that high heat trigger of a 90 heat index, that we're in active communication. We're touching base with our employees. We're looking for those folks that are showing signs and symptoms of heat exposure. We're taking them out of that situation before it gets worse. And then PPE. Remember, PPE is last in our line of defense, but PPE, something to think about relative to heat hazard. PPE can be the problem. So if the job task requires bulky heat holding PPE, we want to make sure that that PPE can be removed when that person is on that rest or break period, because they've got their body needs to be able to cool down. And if they're in that heat holding PPE, even taking a break, their body's not going to be able to cool down. So with PPE, it's kind of twofold. Is there PPE we need to provide for auxiliary cooling? Is there PPE we need to remove during that rest and break period? And, depending on the PPE that might be required, that might require you to take a look at modifying that rest work schedule based off of the type of PPE. Maybe they're not able to work too long in that PPE, need more frequent breaks or job rotation or what have you. Now, the auxiliary cooling can be effective in certain workspaces with certain functions. And examples are cooling vests. There are high visibility cooling vests. There's wetted textiles. I just recently we spent a whole weekend out at a lacrosse field for a tournament, and it was hot. And I don't think I would have made it through that weekend without those wetting cooling towels. I'm a big fan of the wetted cooling towels. You got to keep them wet. But they do really well. And then there's also that water or air cooled garments that are also available. So as we start to wrap things up, if you have a question that you haven't typed in yet, feel free to go ahead and do that. But as we wrap things up, again, just recognize that proposed rule, it's still going through the rulemaking process. Don't ask me when it will be finalized. Those are not things that can be predicted, but it is still going through the process. It's not dead. So what we can do in the meantime, because we do recognize that there is a hazard associated with heat, evaluate the heat risk that you have at your work sites, and make sure that you have participation from those workers that are actually in the heat. This cannot be a health and safety program that is done in isolation. This is a health and safety program that you need engagement with all levels, especially those that are actually working in the midst of the heat. Develop that company or site specific controls that are going to help for your particular hazards in your particular areas using those tools that you have links for from OSHA. Again, that hazard assessment where you're looking at the heat index, you're looking at the workload, you're looking at if the employee is acclimated or not. You're looking at that PPE that could be contributing to the hazard, putting all that into that OSHA calculator, or putting all of that into your own risk assessment form to identify when risks are too high. And when risks are too high, having those specific controls to mitigate those risks. Document all of that in a written program, train in that program, inspect your program to make sure you're actually exercising it and that it's working, and enforce the program for conformance. All right, so I'm about to hop into your questions here. And I'm just going to kind of leave it on this screen as I start to answer some questions. So we do have, we hope you enjoy our complimentary webinar series. We have 2 more webinars scheduled over the next 2 months. Our August webinar, I'm going to be joined by a friend and colleague with Weish, a law firm that we work with. Rita Bolt Barker, who is a sustainability and environmental attorney. She and I are going to discuss how to effectively apply EPA's audit policy. It's a policy that's been around since the early 2000s. And it's a great tool for identifying and mitigating compliance impacts associated with environmental issues. September, my colleague Jake Smith and I will present on the electric vehicle manufacturing industry and the emerging occupational hazards associated with the EV manufacturing, or battery and magnets and things of that nature. So even if you're not in the EV space, but if you're in the space where you do have lithium batteries and magnets and things of that nature, it will be a not miss for sure. Also on your handout, you have links to past webinars that we've offered as well. You can register for all of those by either scanning the QR code or just going to our training page on our website. All right, so let's see here. All right, so we have a question about a certificate of attendance. Unfortunately, we are not able to provide certificates of attendance for webinars because some folks watch these live, some people catch the recording, and so we don't offer certificates. But if you do have some type of CEU requirements that you're trying to document, just be aware that different CEU requirements require different forms of documentation. But if you're trying just to prove, then what I would recommend that you do is just save that email that indicated that you registered, and then save the handouts that we uploaded kind of as proof of attendance if you're trying to document it for some type of CEU type qualification. All right, so we have a question here about, does the National Weather Service heat index table take into account radiant heat from outside work as noted in the NIOSH tables? No, it does not. The wet bulb globe thermometers do take into account radiant heat, but under the proposed rule, it does not require that you invest in that wet bulb globe thermometer. Under the proposed rule, it allows you to decide what monitoring makes the most sense for you. So OSHA anticipates that most people will just do the heat index, where you're taking the environmental temperature and you're taking the environmental humidity, and you're either referencing the table that we showed, or you're putting it into an online heat index calculator. OSHA assumes that most people are going to be doing that. If you're referencing the NIOSH standards, NIOSH does focus on that wet bulb globe thermometer, but OSHA is not requiring that at this time. Let's see, I think those are the two questions. I'm happy to answer any other questions. If you had a question that was, more detailed or lengthy or nuanced and you didn't feel like typing it in, you'll see my contact information there, whether you want to email me or give me a call. Also, you'll see ways to connect with HRP as a whole through our various outreach programs and initiatives. We will keep everybody up to date on the progress of this rule and the next steps and iterations as it continues to go through the rule making process. But not seeing any other last minute questions coming up. I'd just like to thank everybody for your attendance. Feel free to reach out with any questions that emerge from this topic. And also hope to see you on some of our future webinars that we continue to roll out for you. If there's a topic that you're interested in, if there's a topic you would like for us to put on our schedule, let me know. So we would love to hear from you about what topics you want to hear, and we'll throw that into our complimentary webinar schedule. So with that, I will go ahead and conclude and thank y'all one more time, and we hope to hear from you.